Are you ready to get casual? Grab your favorite adult beverage or combustible plant and join us for our roundtable TTRPG discussion. Oh yeah, it's time for Casual Friday. And now, here are your hosts.
Hey everybody, happy Friday, happy Valentine's Day for you romantics out there. We are the Landlocked Warlocks, plus an extra special guest. Jim has fallen into a portal to the realm of Fae Muncie. So I, Ryan Doyle, am your host today. Behind me, as usual, is...
I'm Brad Wolf from Dire Den.
And joining us for the first time is...
I'm Peter from Tales from Elsewhere.
If you don't know Peter, go check out his awesome YouTube channel. There is some very heady but practical game design advice that is relevant to any game master, whether or not you are tinkering with your own system or rule set or just trying to understand why this one stupid thing in the book is the way it is. Big fan. Super happy you could join us, Peter. Today we're talking about a game that isn't D&D, at least for a little bit. And then we're going to talk about all the stuff that WotC's doing to make sure that we continue to talk about D&D, taking over the media world. We're going to dip our toe a little bit into the distribution business. And then we're going to have a roundtable discussion. Chat, I want some help with this one. We're going to talk about downtime, how you do it, what's going on, if you do it in the first place. We're going to do a little talk about that. And then we're going to talk about creating monsters that are not sucking. So that's going to be fun too. I'm looking forward to that. But to start, we have a release date for Daggerheart. The latest, the greatest, one of many dragon killers that are coming out. Gentlemen, any thoughts on Daggerheart coming out on May 20th to your friendly local neighborhood game shop, slightly later worldwide? I'm sorry, my friends in New Zealand, you're going to have to wait till, it looks like June 3rd at the earliest. Yeah. What do you guys think about Daggerheart?
Well, the first thing I noticed was that they were doing the 2-week early release in game stores, very similar to what Wizards of the Coast does. And I thought, that's very much appreciated from the small business owners. I think that's a really cool thing that they're doing there. Beyond that, our resident Daggerheart expert Jim is not here, so I have not played Daggerheart yet. So. But I'm curious. I'm curious to see how big of a seller this is and what kind of impact it has.
Yeah, and I think I actually haven't had a chance to sit down and play Daggerheart yet either. I've read through some of the rules that they have made available. But what I think is the intriguing thing about Daggerheart when it comes to competitors to D&D is they've made, I think, some of the more significant changes to the formula. They've strayed from the assumptions of D&D. They've even abandoned the D20, for example. And I think I like that. I like that they're trying something different. Their core, I look a lot at core die resolutions when I look at games, like what's the core mechanic to it? And the way they use their 2D12 system with hope and despair, I think are the terms.
Hope and fear.
Hope and fear, thank you. That's neat. And you see that kind of thing in more narrative-focused games, right? That's something you see in that realm, not so much in the traditional D&D space as much. So it's cool that they're bringing some of that into the forefront. I just like seeing those kind of novel mechanics.
Yeah, and that's exactly why you're here, is because you know all this mechanic stuff.
Yeah, I look at the dice really hard and I think about it really hard. Yeah, well, a lot of D&D competitors stick with the D20, the exact same numerical structure, right? And this one decided to not, and I think that's cool.
Yeah, this one seems like more similar to Powered by the Apocalypse than it does D&D, right? Like there's definitely some bones of Powered by the Apocalypse in this design.
Absolutely agreed. They've snuck it in, right, into the traditional crowd. They're sneaking that in, and it's going to be a gateway drug maybe to a lot of really cool other RPGs, maybe, right? If it opens them up to those alternatives, I think it's super cool. Even if it's not really made for me, like Daggerheart isn't made for me and my table. That's okay though.
Yeah, well, and if
It's
Um,
entirely too reasonable a perspective to take on the
Oh,
show.
my bad. A hotter take.
No,
no, I mean that's a great point though, like kind of gateway to other games, right? Because I don't know if Daggerheart is going to have an open license for people to be able to make Daggerheart adjacent stuff, right? I don't think we've heard anything.
Oh, I don't know. Yeah, I haven't heard anything.
But if it's similar enough to Powered by the Apocalypse, which does have an open license, right? You could use the Powered by the Apocalypse open license to get pretty similar to Daggerheart to make Daggerheart adjacent products.
Yeah, that's interesting. It would be wise of them to have some sort of license, though, some sort of open license.
Yeah, I would
I would-
assume they would.
just knowing their approach to community building. Daggerheart, if you don't know, we kind of just assume everyone has heard of it by this point, but Daggerheart is the Darrington Press baby, the Critical Role new game. They just finished campaign 3, so there's a lot of speculation that the new campaign out of Critical Role, at least the main campaign out of Critical Role, is going to be powered by Daggerheart. TBD. Some breaking news as far as I'm concerned. Nimble also released officially yesterday, according to Twin Steel, who would know.
Yeah, I saw that
Book.
update in their Discord that it's off to the printers basically as well, that's such a cool milestone for them. It's exciting. Yeah. Speaking of D&D heartbreakers, right?
Well, I actually got a chance to play Daggerheart. I mean, play Nimble recently, and had a blast.
Yeah, we had a very good time the other day. Check out Landlocked Warlock. Stay tuned, like and subscribe, and all the YouTube stuff because that is coming soon. We had a blast. We stress tested the system, and it passed with flying colors. We're a little hard on games sometimes.
Twin Steel actually did a great job running a one shot for us. It was really fun.
He's
Absolutely.
awesome, Twin Steel. Yeah.
Also in the news, WotC's hiring, and I'm sure everyone in chat is clamoring to take part and move to Seattle, join the dark side. But I think that the most interesting thing to me about all of this is that they are hiring a D&D world builder. And if you dig into the job itself, it seems to be like a little more expansive than that. But one, say what you will about the company, the fact that someone is hiring a world builder is just an innately good thing in my book for the world. Yeah, did you guys you polishing up your CVs? Did you send any resumes? What's going on?
My wife's originally from Seattle, so it's tempting, but we've got too much going on the East Coast, so that's a no-go for me.
I'm tempted. Full disclosure, I have applied to one of their game design positions on the D&D team, and I basically just attached my videos of why I disagree with some of their design decisions as my resume.
Ooh,
I did not jump on that. But it's tempting.
makes me
It's
happy.
tempting. I mean, why not? What do you have to risk, right? Just throw a resume at it. I might actually give it a try, just on the off chance maybe it happens. I don't know. The Pacific Northwest is beautiful but cold.
Yeah. The most interesting thing to me about this resume is it talks about the cohesive nature of the worlds of D&D, almost kind of showrunner-esque,
Oh,
right? Like they're looking for somebody who's going to be able to kind of shepherd the different worlds of D&D under the brand, kind of like a Kevin Feige to the Marvel movies. Like, these are all individual movies, but how do we keep it all connected under one brand, right? And have, a through line in the lore and all that sort of stuff. That
Right.
was my kind of reading between the lines of the things in this this ad for this job position.
yeah.
And I think we're gonna get into stuff that. Oh, go.
But I was saying, curious what they're going to do with that role, right? What's their plan?
Yeah.
Well, there's some other news on the agenda that might point towards the answer to that. In this EN World article, there is some fairly convincing reasoning, but I believe it is motivated reasoning that they are hopeful for new settings. in the D&D universe. We got 2 big books on Forgotten Realms coming out. Actually, a lot of stuff that people are mad or missing from the Monster Manual, it seems, is going to appear in the Dungeon Master's version of the Forgotten Realms book. The Eberron is coming. I am no longer willing to hold my breath that we are going to get more. I spent the last year or so hoping that like 5.5 was going to be set in Greyhawk. We were going to get some newness. Okay, maybe the rules aren't as new as we were hoping, but we were going to get some new variety. We dipped a toe into Greyhawk, but we did not get this. 5.5 is now set in Greyhawk. So I don't know if we're building. I hope we're building new worlds instead of just cataloging the old ones again and again and again. But we'll see, I guess.
Well, that was the other implication of this, this hiring notice, right? Is that it seems to imply that they might be looking for someone to help create a new setting, which would be great because we haven't had a new setting since Eberron, right? I mean, I guess Radiant Citadel, right, was the closest thing we got to a new setting.
Yeah, I'll half credit. I'll give it half credit. I see why you say that. Yeah.
Yeah. Like, I mean, like I like Radiant Citadel as like an adventure path, right? Like that it's a good product. It's not enough to really call it a whole new setting. And I guess, we got the overlap with Magic the Gathering with Theros and Ravnica, right? So, but those don't feel like whole settings either, right? Like it's kind of like a crossover with Magic the Gathering. So it'd be interesting to see like a whole new world, right?
Speaking of Little Mermaid, no, I'm sorry. Speaking of Magic the Gathering, the news in town is that they're making a movie and a live action TV show. They're partnering with Netflix for an animated series, Legendary Entertainment for the other two. So all of a sudden, there's a whole lot of Magic the Gathering stuff in the works as far as media goes. How are we feeling about that?
Apprehensive.
Interesting.
Best answer. Best answer.
So I like Magic the Gathering lore in general. I've read a number of the books, but there was a trend that started after the big reset button they did 10 years ago, where the narrative is now primarily about planeswalkers as these sort of superhero-like characters that create a through line. And in my opinion, all of their storytelling got worse when they made this change, because each of these individual worlds now just had the same cast of characters half the time. So I have this creeping sensation that the stories they're going to tell in these movies and shows are just going to be about the planeswalkers. And it'll be Jace, Elspeth, Sorin Markov. Probably it'll be like the heavy hitters that get all the meat, like that are the really popular ones. When a lot of their best storytelling was done in settings without a focus on those planeswalkers, like Ravnica or the original Urza's Saga. These are all really like interesting stories with great characters and not just the same set of 5 people that put on like a cowboy hat in one scene to change settings, right?
Yeah, well, and even when they do introduce a new planeswalker with a new setting, right? It's still the same like story beats, right? It's how did this person become a planeswalker? Now that they are a planeswalker, what does it mean to their world that they're from? And then how are they going to now engage with the other planeswalkers that we already know? That that seems to be the repetitive story. Yeah.
And planeswalkers aren't a problem in the story. Some of their strongest storylines that would make really good TV series is like Urza's Saga, some of the oldest stuff that sets up the Phyrexians as a villain. Like it sets up a ton. You could do Mirrodin as well, which was a really interesting story. My favorite setting is Ravnica, and you could tell the coolest stories in that setting for a TV show. It would just be absolutely awesome. But I know they're not going to do it, sadly. They'll focus on something else. It'll probably be like Nicol Bolas as the villain, and they'll keep it really tame.
a lot of the articles about this use the phrase cinematic universe, right? That's kind of like how all this reads. Like there's a Netflix TV show, there's potential movie in the works, and then there's also buzz about a D&D Netflix show, and like, is this all going to be connected? Are they going to try to do one more run at can we be the next MCU?
The hubris. Well, and the formula that Marvel used was first make a couple really good movies, then build a then you build a multiverse and a shared universe on top of that. That was how the Infinity Saga had such a strong run, is it built standalone quality content at the start and then layered on top of it slowly, right? You don't open with the Justice League like DC tried to do.
I will say, I don't think Marvel gets enough. Thank you for hitting that. Yes, I don't think Marvel gets enough credit for pulling off the Avengers. Like, it is, I think, because there's this, even to this day, nerds have taken over media, but like, there's a highbrow, lowbrow. It's very hard to give Marvel, like comic book movies, credit for doing something that, like, on paper should not have worked. And it did very successfully. And now everyone thinks, like, oh, yeah, we'll just do that again. It took them a decade. They were set up very carefully to do it. Maybe they did it by accident by making a bunch of good stuff.
Right. It didn't hurt that they had some great actors that they were able to snag. Right. And they kind of built it on Robert Downey Jr. But the point you made about them taking their time, it took a decade, and they didn't try to rush it. And sure, there were some drops in quality throughout that 10-year run. Some peaks and valleys as far as quality. On the whole, they kept everything fairly consistent overall. But yeah, they took a decade before they had their giant team up movies really happen.
Yeah. And that seems to be what everybody forgets, right? Like, any topic we're talking about, like any fandom, like, we could get into the weeds on a whole bunch of different issues, whether we're talking about Star Wars or Star Trek or, MCU, DCEU, all that stuff. Ultimately, it boils down to, you got to tell a good story. You got to make, your characters likable and compelling and deliver at the end of the movie. So I feel like I just watched an enjoyable story. And then beyond that, you can start connecting it to other stuff.
Right. Shocking. What a concept. Make a good movie first, right? It seems like it should be so obvious.
Yeah, I don't know why I have to explain that. Like, that's
we're going crazy here. Make a good movie first. Make something I want to watch. Yeah, like a buddy, not to go off on a tangent on movies. I remember my friend told me once, he was on a big flight, an international flight, and he saw that the 3.5-hour Justice League movie was on there. And he said he turned it off partway through because he was that bored, trapped on a plane, unable to do anything else. He's like, I'm just not going to watch this for like 10 hours. Just decided against it. Right. I thought that was really funny.
Yeah.
I will say, and this is Dunning-Kruger, because I know I haven't played Magic in at least a decade, probably closer to 2 decades now. But the fact that we're getting 2 production companies and potentially 3 products, I think increases the odds that one of them is good. The cynic in me thinks that it'll be the Netflix cartoon, which they will cancel without any fanfare for reasons that no one quite understands after a season or 2. But that's my prediction, knowing nothing.
My dream is that. So what I love about Magic, and because I'm a mechanics guy, I'm like a systems guy, is how the color pie works, the color wheel. I think its interactions from a narrative standpoint and design standpoint are super cool. So I want them to do a setting that explores that, because that's something that's unique about Magic. What I don't need is a generic high fantasy adventure story about some super powerful wizards. That's could be anything really at the end of the day. But that's why settings like Ravnica, Alara, Khans of Tarkir, and there's probably one other one that really played with the color wheel in a really interesting way. But those ones explored what these color combinations meant. And that's so cool. Like, what is it when you have the enemy colors? Like, what is it when you combine blue and green, which are enemy colors? What does it mean when they're together? And turns out it's genetic experimentation. It's evolution and oozes and like, oh, that's so interesting, right? That kind of stuff is so cool. Take the enemy colors and mix and match them. What's black? The color of control and selfishness, and white, the color of community. Together, it's like the mob or an evil church, right? It's anyway, it's fascinating. Make a show about that stuff. That's Ravnica, and that's why. Super.
I'm just gonna
Great point.
underline that empowered speech by Peter and say we need. I don't know if it's happened already, but I need Peter and Phil in the same room or the same stream to talk about the color system in Magic the Gathering.
Yeah, we could fill 90 minutes with that.
Yeah, I'm curious to see if over the course of 5.5, if we do end up with more Magic the Gathering settings being brought into D&D, right? Because there's so many more than just Ravnica and Theros.
Absolutely.
And kind of what was interesting to me in the coverage of this, like, oh, they're coming out with a bunch of Magic the Gathering stuff, was the speculation that, like, oh, you're doing Magic, that means D&D, right? And in fact, there's another D&D thing coming to Netflix, apparently under the auspices of Sean Levy, who's the Deadpool guy. So maybe we're gonna get some good live action D&D Netflix show? Question mark? I mean, again, how we feeling about this?
Apprehensive. I'll just say that again. Apprehensive.
Yeah.
Well, I actually really enjoyed the Dungeons and Dragons film they made just a few years ago. Right. I actually really enjoyed it. I thought it was a lot of fun. And I actually really liked the Jeremy Irons one from the late 90s, early 2000s. It's not good, but I enjoyed it. And again, it's kind of the same thing I was mentioning about a Magic the Gathering adaptation. I worry that it's going to be about a roster of superheroes in effect, rather than a story of some adventurers. You know what I mean? I want something that starts off at least a little bit more grounded. I think that'd be really cool, because most D&D adventures, if you start at level 1, right, you're fighting goblins, you're not slaying gods.
Right, I agree. The best D&D stories are the low level stories because they're the most relatable. And going back to good storytelling, right? If your audience can relate to your characters and identify with their struggles, right, then it's easier to hook them. And it's much easier to do, right, with low level characters, just trying to survive, just trying to get by, fighting the local powers that be, right? That's far more relatable than like the superhero gods. And that's why I always, like, as a kid growing up, I always liked Spider-Man more than Justice League, right? Like as a kid, like I could see myself in Peter Parker, right? Like Superman and was ungodly powerful, and Batman was ungodly rich. Like
both superpowers I wouldn't mind having.
But I'm probably not, right?
Probably not. Yeah, I'm with you on Spider-Man. Spider-Man's the best. Definitely a personal favorite of mine for my whole life. Absolutely. Yeah, that's a really good point. Again, that they need to tell a good story first, and not be a 45-minute time slot of winking at the camera about a reference to D&D. Like a reference to the cultural aspect of D&D. Like make it a show that isn't trying to be too self-aware. I know that that's a complaint that's often levied against later Marvel, like post-Infinity War in particular, is it's a little bit too self-aware of what it is, and it winks at the camera a little bit too much. So I'd love it for it to actually like be a story, contain, not a cultural reference to Dungeons and Dragons, but do let them go to the Tomb of Annihilation or something, season 5, right? They can start off, I would love to see like dungeon crawls in TV show. I think that'd be super cool. And you already have the Critical Role show to show high level play. Like that show's about pretty high level characters, facing elder dragons and all sorts of really intense stuff. So that fills that niche. So give me the low fantasy stuff for a little bit at least, right? I think it'd be cool.
Yeah, I agree. And if they are doing both of these as separate things, right? If there's going to be a D&D show and there's going to be a Magic the Gathering show, like let D&D be that low fantasy, because the Magic the Gathering is got to be high fantasy, right? So
no. It's pretty much every setting is very high fantasy in Magic Gathering, even if the story they tell sometimes is fairly narrow. Like the Ravnica, first round of Ravnica books are the story of one beat cop, basically, and him uncovering a mystery. But Ravnica is one of the high fantasy settings one can imagine.
Yeah, it's like Coruscant with magic, right? It's
yeah.
So
what's not to love about that?
Yeah, it's a city that takes up the whole globe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it had some of the best art for their lands, some most creative artwork for their lands. Because what is a forest? What are the plains when the city covers every inch of the world? And so they had to get very creative. And it's the skyline of all of the buildings level going out to the horizon are the plains. So really cool stuff.
Yeah, there's so much potential, and we're so jaded because we're hurt because they were jerks so many freaking times. But like, oh man, there's just a pool of resources here that if they use effectively, they could do incredible things with. There's so much world building already done that they could tap into. So, and like a Magic the Gathering series is a storyboard halfway, like a lot of the best comic movies are hewing fairly close to the comics. We've seen a lot of awesome things come out of graphic novels because you have a visual medium to start and these awesome stories already told, and now we're just translating them and maybe polishing them up, streamlining them a little bit. So there's so much potential there. And I too really enjoyed the latest, the new D&D movie. I thought they did a great job of making it relatable to new people. There was plenty of, winky fan service stuff, but it wasn't, you wouldn't lose it. You wouldn't lose the person who didn't understand someone just said like, oh, that was a natural 20. Like, what are we talking about here? they hit the right notes. They did perfect. I think the timing was off because they were jerks and did some stupid stuff. But if the show is cut from that same cloth, I think it would be very good.
Yeah. I was one of the few people in the theater that pointed at the screen and went, Thumberchod from Out of the Abyss. I ran that adventure. Like, I got to tell my players.
And like, that's some people's introduction to D&D, and like, oh, like this fat red dragon is canon. Like, that's exciting. Like, it's, you got to serve both masters if you're going to have a successful thing. And if you're going to tell me a story and assume I know all this stuff already, not the best version of that story you're going to tell me.
Right.
Yeah, that movie really struck a perfect balance, right? Of like having noticeable things. Like the hardcore fan could be like, oh, I know what that is. I know who those guys are, all this stuff. Harpers and Red Wizards of Thay and all these things. But if you like my wife and kids were able to watch it, like not knowing any of that lore and just enjoy it for the heist film that it was, right?
Make a fun movie. Make an enjoyable movie first, right?
Yep.
Shocking formula.
And wherever you're, like, if you are still boycotting WotC, right? Or you're over 5th edition, you were hoping 5.5 was actually going to be something different and it's not. You don't feel like playing the same game for a decade and you're trying to bring people into another game, maybe because it's your game, whatever the case may be. The point that gets lost a lot of the time is that a healthy D&D is the wide open flashing signs on top of the gate that are going to get new people interested in the hobby, period. If they bounce off of D&D, there's no way you're going to start to explain the nuances of what is different about your thing. And if you're explaining why D&D sucks to get someone interested in your thing, unless that person's already pissed off at D&D, that's also not the greatest pitch note out there. So I hope it's successful.
Fruit. It's low-hanging fruit too. It's it's not that interesting to say D&D bad. If you're going to criticize something about the game system, sure. But I mean, like I'll release a video where I say this structure that they use in D&D's rules I don't agree with. But after this, I'm going to go play D&D with my friends because it's still a fun game, right? You don't have to paint the system as some bugbear, right? To use the term more generically than the D&D term, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
In the marketing side, is tell us why your game is cool, not why this other game is bad, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and there's been articles from folks in the OSR community who, clearly explain how OSR benefits from new editions of D&D, right? Because with every new edition of D&D, you have an exodus. You have people who don't want to play the new edition, and a lot of those end up, playing OSR games. But then at the same time, new editions also bring in new players to D&D who will eventually, a lot of them, dabble in OSR games, right? Or maybe make a full conversion to OSR games. So, like you said, a healthy D&D is good for the hobby.
Yeah, without D&D, really the cultural reach of this hobby would not be sufficient to sustain most indie designers, right? All these cool games, they just wouldn't have a place if we didn't have the prior 50 years of the D&D brand getting out there to the wider community. I mean, just don't play the game if you don't like it, right? I mean, no one's forcing you to play Dungeons and Dragons. You don't show up to your local game store and they sit you down, put a D&D book in front of you and say you're not leaving until you play a session of this, right?
You're not allowed to buy Daggerheart until you play 10
Yeah.
sessions of Dungeons and Dragons.
You're not allowed to enjoy D&D unless you've played every other role-playing game out there. And only then can you come back and play D&D or something, right?
Well, I feel like, we probably have some of the similar vibes on our players there. But the game shop that's selling a ton of PHBs, right, is more likely to start stocking Daggerheart or Nimble or insert your game of choice. It's good for the hobby, for D&D to be healthy. And it's bad for the hobby long term. It was great for all these fantasy heartbreakers when D&D tried to cut everybody's throats short term. It created a lot of opportunities for a lot of people to differentiate themselves and fill in gaps, and we're getting a lot of cool benefits from it today. Like I don't know if Daggerheart's the game for me. I'm excited to try it. I'm excited that they took a swing and built a different system and not just D20 plus 1 or 2 or 3. But long term, people coming in through D&D, experiencing the limitations of it, and then looking broader is good for everybody.
Yeah, especially your local brick and mortar store where there's no way they could get by selling copies of Traveler or something, right? As much as that is a cool system, I always go and buy my copies of D&D products from them in person, right? I go buy them from this store because I want that store to exist, even if I don't get over there as much these days, right? That's the only way they stay afloat is people come in and buy stuff from them. So I don't think I can take down evil Hasbro myself, but I can help keep my local game store afloat by going and getting the new Monster Manual from them maybe this weekend.
Yeah, absolutely. And the same is true of Magic the Gathering, right? So like I hope these movies, TV shows, all these projects, I hope they're successful. One, because I like to watch cool shit and I want it to be cool so I can watch it. But also Magic the Gathering pays the bills at most brick and mortar stores, right? Like Magic the Gathering, and I don't know if our audience realizes it, that they make far more money off of Magic the Gathering than D&D. Local, like I know my local store, is very solvent solely on their Magic the Gathering. Everything else they sell outside of Magic the Gathering is like gravy, but like they do really well off of Magic the Gathering.
Yep. And Warhammer, my local store, it's big on those. They get a lot of people coming in and buying those kind of products. Magic the Gathering doesn't take up much physical space in a store either. It's very efficient for your local game store to stock. And there's, especially with the new release schedule, tons of new sets coming out constantly.
Perhaps too many. Let's open it up to the round table, because on Tuesday I might be looking at a full session of downtime, and I over the years have tried various strategies. I've had various rule sets, various approaches, opened it up to the players, and I haven't ever quite hit on the perfect downtime system approach. So I'm interested to hear from you guys and from chat. I mean, first of all, do you incorporate downtime into your game? How formal is that process? And yeah, how?
Well, a couple of things just to start off about downtime is one, throughout the course of running 5th edition, because I was playing it so much, because it was so easy to find players, I've really gotten to the habit of using cliffhangers a lot. So I end a session with a cliffhanger and have that strong start to my next session, and realized, after about 5 years of like that kind of new style of DMing, that I was leaving out a lot of downtime because the story was just moving so quick, which is like both fun but also different for me, right? Having grown up on 1st edition. The other thing about downtime is months ago, I was working on an idea for a video about downtime, and I put questions out there in different, forums, and realized that people do downtime very differently. Like, there were some people that just role play everything. Like they're like, what do you mean downtime? That's just part of the game. That you just role play it all. And then there are other people like, no, that's all out of game stuff. We handle it over Discord or email or something like that. That everything at the table is pure adventure. And then there's, various degrees in between. So it's interesting that there was so many distinct differences in the way people handle downtime that some people are like, what do you mean by downtime? Like, they didn't even get the question because they were those people that just role played like all the stuff.
I kind of agree with the people that say, what is downtime, to a degree. And only because there's a specific ideology, and again, there's nothing wrong with this ideology, of you have discrete modes of play that are handled differently, where you are in town, then enter the adventure, and then return from the adventure before starting another adventure, right? You have an excursion, and that is kind of the old school. You go down into the dungeon, and then what happens when you come back and you need to nurse all your wounds, right? These are discrete story modes. But I think about things in terms of movies a lot, just because I ingest so many. And there's a reason you don't always see the characters going shopping for their food day to day in a movie, because it's just not interesting, right? And the way I tend to run a game is there isn't a clear delineation between when the adventure is done and when you have something else to do. I'm telling a story, like if there's a story going on, and if nothing is happening, I'm not going to zoom in on that at the table. That's my approach to it. So if the player needs to go and buy potions, I'll just say, just mark off how many you buy. Like, if there's a potion seller in town, we're not going to zoom in on that unless there's some sort of narrative there. But I tend to not also have like many vendors in my game. I play like low fantasy, and I run low fantasy in even in D&D, I run low fantasy. And so to me, having a mode that is not gameplay, I guess, is not just how I run it, right? If there's gameplay to be had in town, then we're going to play the game. The game has not ended. We're not going shopping, right, necessarily. And if we are, the way one of my groups does it, I'm not the DM in that group, but you're expected to do it between sessions. Just mark off your gold, and when we get back, it's time to get back to the story of the game. So that's generally how I do it. If there's something to be done in town, then I'm going to run it like I would any other story beat in the game.
Yeah, and that's mostly what I do is exactly what you just described. We kind of skip most downtime activities and just, the players are like, I want my character to do this next time we're here. I'm like, fine. But when we get to the like a completion point, like if we were talking about like a movie or a book, like between the acts, right? Like between the first act and the second act, there's like a downbeat. I'll do like the role play in town, but as a game master, I am totally focused on putting more plot hooks in front of the players, right? So when they're shopping or when they're trying to decide where are we going to spend our gold, all those sort of kind of side, bar kind of things that the players are doing. With each NPC they're encountering, I've got my list of plot hooks and my secrets and clues, and every shopkeeper they run into for them is a plot hook, a secret, or a clue. Because I'm trying to set up the next act of the adventure, right?
Yeah, that's a really good way to put it, because I'm the same way. I think of them, I think of friendly NPCs as pressure points that I can apply later. This is somebody I could have abducted. That's what I think every time. Like, ooh, if I threaten this one, they'll come a running, right? No NPC is more protected than like the old lady that bakes food in the bakery that the players visit. You put a finger on that NPC and the players come a running. So yeah, I'm with you on that. There's a purpose to it, right? There's a purpose for either the GM or the players to that experience, because it's all the game still, right? It's the game.
Right. And I think what people like about it is the verisimilitude of it, right? They want to push the boundaries of the game a little bit to see, if the DM has that stuff prepared, right? Does this world feel lived in? So when I go to the town, I'm like, well, these people have to have light sources. So who makes the candles around here, right? Who makes the lanterns? These people, like, they wear clothes. So is there a tailor in town, right? All of those kind of things. Like, I don't know if players do it consciously. Like, I don't think they're trying to be jerks about it. Like, I think, like, it's just, they want to test the realness of your world, right?
Yeah, I know I liked you, Brad, but we keep coming on these same sort of things, because I actually think about where this town gets its lumber and stone for its construction. I think about that every time. Whenever I come into a town as a player and it's like got all these stone edifices, and I think, where's the quarry for this? Like, where do they get the stone? We're in the middle of a forest. As a player, I think about that as well, even though most players don't tune in to that. But I'll know the answer when I'm running a game.
Yeah, as a DM, I'm always looking for the resources. Like, that's the choke point, right? Like, yes, you can abduct the little old lady bakery, and I'm hearing from one of your players that you do that quite a bit, apparently. I find that if I do that too much, I start to traumatize the players, and they no longer form connections. But maybe I did that, inelegantly in my earlier years.
Yeah, I just saw the message from Tim pop up there saying, like, I get everybody really attached to my NPCs. Yeah. I try to make them like lovable or interesting, and but they know there's the sword of Damocles hovers over their head. It's coming down at one point. Whichever one they show the most affection toward is the new pressure point.
So it's interesting that we almost have, there's like different definitions of like what even is downtime. Like I set this up and failed to define our terms, and it's funny, for a lot of people it's into like town stuff, shopping, whatever. But to me, downtime is often just like a different level of resolution time-wise, and not just talking about He Ran Dragon Heist. And in that, built in is like, here's a business for you to run, one, so that I can threaten it and get you moving because you care about this thing. But two, for me, a lot of the time, downtime is like combat, 6-second chunk of time, exploration, roughly a 10-minute chunk of time. Now we're talking about things that take days and weeks, and what's the quarterly profits of this tavern that we're running? Okay, we're gonna resolve that. I'm gonna keep it in the story as best I can, or it's not remotely part of the story, and like I'll email you later that you have 4d10 gold pieces extra. That's not interesting to me, so we'll do it outside of game night.
I usually call that narrative play. Right, I call that the narrative phase of the game. That's just how I have always referred to it. But yeah, it's the idea where you're no longer the time. The time is whatever you need it to be, and you can even have die rolls that represent, doing something for a week. That sort of narrative, non-combat, non-urgent play. Yeah, downtime has always meant something different to me. This is the problem with these word definitions, right? Is everybody uses them slightly differently at their table. But yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That narrative mode of play is tough to mechanicize too, in a way that's
Yes.
satisfactory. Blades, I think somebody was mentioning somewhere in the chat, but like Blades in the Dark is a good example of codifying downtime activities. That's player fate. Like the players choose what they do, planning heists and indulging in their vices. They get all this cool stuff that they can do, and there's a body of rules that they don't need to like check with the GM on. Like there's stuff they can do in their downtime, which is neat because they have planning, heist, downtime. That's how every session is constructed in that game.
Elder Goblin mentions carousing,
Yeah.
and like Shadow Dark has some of the best carousing mechanics I've seen, right? Where like, which I really like because I grew up with like Conan, and like in the back of my mind, like Conan, the way Conan's supposed to work is he goes and he gets rich, overthrowing a government or delving a dungeon, and then he comes back and he just spends it all because
the loses every penny.
Yeah, the next story he's broke again and drunk again,
Yeah.
and where'd all the money go? Right. So like the carousing is just like that's Conan for me. Like I get that. But that's an example of like a game mechanic that like helps handle that narrative between adventures. So you can do it very mechanically like that, right? Or you can have the total opposite end of the spectrum. Like I ran a campaign that was when Game of Thrones was super popular, right? So this was very heavy on the faction play and all the king had been murdered and his brother was the new regent and the son who was the rightful heir was missing, and my players got all caught up in the politics of that. So oftentimes the downtime in that campaign became like this heavy political thriller role play, like even to the point of like a trial where one of the players was like the lawyer. One of the player characters was like the lawyer, trying to prosecute the evil brother who was the regent of the kingdom, right? So you can have two dramatic extremes when it comes to downtime.
Yeah, and I'm sure both of you and probably most people watching this will agree that some of the most memorable moments in any role-playing game you've played didn't even involve the dice. Maybe not even relevant to the system itself. It was the story that you ended up telling, at the table. Like a trial among players. You may not even have them roll dice. You may even have them argue it out, right? And you're not going to necessarily have to codify that. The system is there to facilitate, not restrict. Even if there are rules in place in the system, you can always break free of it.
Yeah,
I do like when games have some scaffolding you can start with, though, at least from a player-facing structure, right? Like things the players know that they're capable of doing in downtime. Like there's a carousing table, right? The player looks at it and be like, "Oh boy, I can't wait to get back to town and roll." In some games, like you just roll carousing, and there's all these mishaps and fun stuff that then lead into the no dice required storytelling, like one where you wake up naked with no money. Now we can role play that and have a bunch of like fun with that, right? That's a common result, right? You get robbed or something in the night. That stuff's great.
Yeah. Well, in one example, you're talking about like the like super memorable moments that had nothing to do with rolling the dice was in that political campaign when the players they basically played like they're like a legal team, right? Because they're trying to prosecute this this regent, and they're interviewing witnesses and they're asking questions and they're figuring everything out, and they realize that the people they thought were heroes, right, and they were on their side opposing the regent, that they were the ones that actually killed the king. and like their fate, like their jaws dropped when like it's like, we have to stop asking questions, because if we find out these guys are bad too, then we can't put anybody on the throne.
Yeah, that's awesome. And you don't need a rule to tell you how to tell that story, right? You don't necessarily need something there. Yeah. But that is, I think, for those of us that have been playing the game for a long time, playing tabletop role-playing games for a long time, I find it really easy to practically run a whole session without the dice, right? With the players, with the story. But I always think about, what if there was a new player the new group of friends, none of them have played. What sort of scaffolding would they need, right, to be able to get to that point? Because I know that when I started running D&D 25 plus years ago, all I did was adapt bad stories from anime I liked as a teenager or something, right? I wasn't exactly good at facilitating these things without just copying some cool movie I watched, right? It's hard to come up with those. So and the third edition didn't have the best scaffolding for me to build on when I was 13 or whatever. I picked up that book the first time. I don't remember what year this was. Yeah, so at the same time, for veterans, we don't need it as much, but I do like it when games have something there to get you started. I think that's good maybe for new players picking it up, at least to some degree.
Yeah, I think that's why I liked Shadow Dark design, because I got to play Shadow Dark before I ever game mastered it, and as a player, like that extra bonus, like you get out of the dungeon, you just leveled up, but now there's this extra system that if we spend enough money on these tables and roll well enough, we're going to get some more experience points and we're going to have a head start on our next level up. Like that was super motivating as a player. Like,
yeah, they integrated it into the game itself, right? It's not just a side thing. It's part of the game still. You've left the dungeon, but the game is still going. Right.
Yeah.
I mean, we could probably spend the whole 90 minutes talking about just the small, smart decisions that Kelsey made for Shadow Dark, right? There's a number of, no one thing is super dramatic, but there's a number of very small, smart decisions like that, right? So I agree. Shadow Dark's a great example. Give the scaffolding and then let the story kind of pop out of that.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. I am fortunate. I consider myself fortunate to half of the time I have a brand new player at the table, just the way things fall. So the idea of being okay, here's a month of story. What do? You can do anything. That's analysis paralysis immediately. That is not helping a new player play this game. They don't know all the tropes and the moves, and they're not importing some old rule set that they played 10 years ago, 20 years ago to fill in these gaps. So I do think you need some sort of elegant scaffolding. It doesn't have to become a game in and of itself. It doesn't have to feel like we're playing a new game now suddenly, but having some sort of structure and oh boy, do I love carousing, XP for gold. It solves a lot of problems. Well, we got 50,000 gold pieces. What do we do with it? Right now, the answer is bastions, which is, we can argue about how effective that is. But the idea of you spend this money to level up, and here's a little gambling mini game. Everybody loves a little risk reward, right? If you hit this number, you're getting 1.5 XP. But if you go over it, now you're in debt to the mob. And we know what the next quest line's going to be, or whatever. You're going to wake up naked, or you're going to some celestial being is going to swoop down and save you, but now you owe them one. Yeah, all sorts of generative opportunities. It's the best. If you've never used that, if it feels kind of hackneyed, or it's just not quite in the tone of the Sword and Sandals, Conan, you can do a lot with carousing, whatever game you're playing.
Yeah, definitely. I love new players so much. I love having new players at a table. You can surprise them with monsters that veterans have the stat block memorized for. One of my favorite monsters of all time is the Roper, and no one outside of the D&D community knows what the heck that is. And they are super scary if you don't know what they are.
Yeah, I remember dropping Displacer Beasts into an adventure one time with all brand new players, and they were all freaked out by this thing.
Oh, it's so good.
What, it's lurking in the shadows? Is it a cat? What is it? And then it has tentacles. And what the hell is it? Yeah.
What? And yeah, that's why it's so great. That's why we're talking about D&D bringing new players in. I don't understand people that want to close the gates on new players, because new players are super fun to run games for. Super fun. It's all new to them, and I think it's a blast.
And they will surprise you. They don't come in with this predetermined idea of what the right thing to do is, what the best optimal thing to do is, and they'll be like, oh, okay, I've seen this movie, I'm going to do this. It's this guy gets it. I don't have to explain the rules to you. Okay, the math part we'll talk about. But like, yes, like the core fantasy of it all, without the rules in the way, comes from new players oftentimes much quicker than the experienced player who's like, all right, let's go. I'm going to create this character. I'm going to tinker with this. I'm going to understand every little
Here's
thing.
my
And
build.
then I'm going to try to, here's my build. And now I'm going to make a conscious effort to try to pretend to forget that.
Yeah. Those new players get really invested in the story sometimes. Like they will, like the old lady baker down the street. And when you threaten that new player will be incensed. Like they will be all in on that.
Yeah, we are. There's some awesome stuff in chat. If you're not reading, if you're not subscribed to Landlocked Warlocks, do that. And that is where most of us are chatting right now. And there's some great conversation going on. I expected to incorporate all of this, and you guys are too smart and erudite. There's a lot of awesome ideas here. We touched on some of them. But I appreciate you all down there. We're starting in chat and in this conversation to like flirt with monster introductions, and that's the next point on the agenda. I'm curious what makes a good monster, and if we're going to say it in YouTube terms, what makes monsters suck, and let's do the opposite. And as we percolate that on for a sec, I want to give you guys a chance to what's coming up. Promo yourselves. We don't do enough of that in this place. We do the BSE versions once in a while, but like, what's on deck for Dire Den and Tales from Elsewhere?
I just released a video today, which is not my usual day to release a video. So everybody, please go watch that because it's probably not going to get the normal amount of views because it's not coming out on Thursday. But yeah, and I've just as a channel, I've tried to kind of making some shifts in my content and kind of go back to the content that kind of put my channel on the map. Shorter videos, more focused on, direct, like gameplay oriented dungeon design, adventure design stuff. I've had a ton of fun doing all the interviews I've done over the last several months, but the YouTube algorithm, or maybe everybody out there, just doesn't watch those as much as the shorter form stuff. So I'm kind of redoubling my efforts to kind of get back to the roots of my channel.
So what dropped today?
Today is how to run a one shot. And I take the example from the new Dungeon Master's Guide. Those little sample adventures. I take the level 1 adventure out of that and show you how to put it into a flow chart to run a one shot.
Undervalued skill. I've definitely failed to stick the landing of a one shot more than once. It's like, all right, guys, I guess this is a 2 to 3 shot now. I don't. And I think a lot of people don't realize I'm a big fan of one shot as the like, here, kid, have some candy. Like, we're gonna play D&D for the first time. You're gonna show up in this seat every Wednesday for the next 2 to 3 years. No, thank you, sir. But like, hey, we're gonna play D&D one time. Come hang out, see if you like it. Whew. That's how you hook them. Peter,
just really
going on
quick
with
on
you,
the
man?
one shot. The best
Yeah, sure.
feeling is you run a one shot for players and they're like, when can we play more? They like, oh, don't leave me with just this one little bit. I want to keep going, right? That's such a good feeling because then you got them. Yeah. So what's new on my end? So I did release a video today, and it's a kind of, what did you say? You described me earlier as heady but reasonable or something like that.
That sounds like me.
Yeah, I released a video today about GM facing versus player facing rule structures, which is why it's top of mind in this conversation. And that's a really interesting subject that I get a lot of people arguing with me on the internet about. When I say that it's okay to have rules for social interaction, some people think that the only form of social interaction in a role-playing game should be no rules. And I don't agree with that, even if that's how I often run my own games. Like, I don't necessarily codify my own. So the video touches on that. As far as what's new, there's playtest materials out for my game right now that are pretty fun. You can make some characters in my Weird West setting called Tales from Elsewhere Clockworld, and that's all on my website, on my YouTube channel. And I will be going to Gen Con this year, so that's some news.
Oh,
I've never been before. So I'll be running some games there. But that's down the line of ways. But yeah, I've got a video today that I think is interesting.
And tell us a little bit about Tales of Elsewhere as far as like the
Sure.
the game itself, and then also the setting, because the setting looks very unique to me.
I am more than happy to. So, Tales from Elsewhere, the brand, is action horror tabletop role playing games. And so, what that means from a mechanic standpoint is it doesn't use hit points, it uses a wound system. It's fairly expedient on things that aren't the focus of action horror. So, things like social interaction, downtime are handled expediently because they're not the emphasis of the game. So it rides the line between some kind of more narrative structures, like wounds having more like narrative oomph to them, but also kind of tactical. It's riding the line in a couple of those little spots. And the first setting is Clockworld, which is post-apocalyptic Weird West. So if you like, I like things like Deadlands and all these kind of classic ones. There are dozens of us out there who love the super narrow niche of post-apocalyptic Weird West. And so that's the setting. It has an emphasis on horror and on, relevant to the conversation we're about to have, on monsters as folklore rather than an encyclopedia entry from an omniscient narrator, presented more as the people in the world would encounter them. So they got cool names like the Arizona Tenor and the Kentucky Sawbones. These are the names of some of the monsters, rather than Hand Demon, as an example. Right. So yeah, that's the quick of it. It's action horror. It's very violent. It's a very violent game, but it's very gruesome. The wound system means players aren't necessarily dying easily, but they are getting dismembered easily. So it's not that you die randomly, but you can get your leg caught in a bear trap, or you can, have an arm blown off by a shotgun, right? These are all things that can happen in the game, and you'll try to survive it.
Have a festering wound from a zombie bite.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. The way I phrase it is the goal is survival, not victory. That's the game's conceit, right? In D&D, the goal is victory because it's a heroic fantasy, and that's really good for that. So from the outset, the players are called survivors, not heroes. Their goal is to survive. It's a little different.
I love a game that knows what it is, right? Like if you, 5e is trying to be all things to all people and is very successful at that for a lot of, you can, throw stones, but it's good for that reason. But a game that's tight, you want a good genre specific experience. Oh man, this is a game about killing monsters in the Weird West, and there's consequences to getting, like, this thing could rip your arm off and add it to its collection, and that's going to change things. That's going to make an impact. Like, yes, you're speaking my language.
Yeah, do you want to put on a cowboy hat and shoot a zombie? Do I got a game for you?
It all comes back to cowboy hats with you. I'm starting to see the pattern here.
Yeah. One of the favorite pages in the rule book for character creation is the last step of character creation is pick a hat. And it's the page is all the different hat styles you would have in the late 19th century.
Nice
decision.
There's such an elegance to that of like the little details.
Yeah, like the exclamation point at the end of the sentence, right? That's a good comment from Jorben there.
Yeah, Jorben chiming in. Elder Goblin Games, check them out if you haven't yet. What makes a good monster? An actionable monster that presents interesting problems and stakes. So right out of the gate, I mean, first question is what everything else beyond the monster, right? Context.
Yeah, well, and because I'm a fan of Brad's content, the Periton video you did a few weeks ago, I forget the date of that. That is how one should approach monster design, because the Periton is an overlooked monster in the monster manual. People don't use this monster a lot, but it has one of the best narrative hooks for almost any of the monsters in the book. I don't watch his video on it; it's great. But you can see how it's folklore based, right? It's a story you could warn somebody about. Don't do this because you could become a Periton, or like the Periton will come get you. And that's so cool. And you can tell such an interesting story that isn't just smack it with a sword, right? In fact, the way you set up that story, I mean, I won't spoil it. Go watch that video. The way you set it up, the players didn't even realize what they were fighting. And that's really cool.
Yeah, because it sets it up as like, here's a murder mystery, but then there's also this other monster that keeps attacking the town, and then wait a second, are these two things the same thing? Yeah, and I think that's what makes monster design, like good monster design, very interesting, is when it helps the game master tell the story, right? Going back to Ryan's comment, like, the YouTube version is more than a bag of hit points, right? It's got to do something that evokes a narrative, right, or gives you an interesting mechanic at the table, right? The monsters that the players can find a way to take away one of its abilities, right?
Yeah, it's interactable,
right?
In the term from Magic the Gathering, from building Magic the Gathering decks is applicable here. The idea that you have questions and answers in a deck. I don't know if anybody's familiar with this concept, but a monster should ask the players questions, mechanically speaking, right? We can set the narrative aside for a moment, but mechanically speaking, the monster asks the players a question. Can you handle this mechanic? What is it asking the players, right? And whether that's something as simple as it's very mobile. It's asking the players to handle that in some way. It's hard to pin down. So a good monster presents a problem that is a puzzle unto itself, not just a bag of hit points from a mechanic standpoint. Because you could have the coolest backstory in the world and then present them with like the brown bear stats in the fight. And the brown bear asks the question of just kill it first. Are you going to kill it before it's claw bite kills you or whatever it is, right? It's not actually asking a question apart from it kind of hurts. So that's vital, right? What's the question mechanically that it's asking the players?
Yeah, and I think the Boulette is one example of that. Like, not the 5th edition version, right? Because it's really not much more than a bear, other than the fact that it can burrow.
Yeah, it's a burrowing bear.
It's a burrowing bear. But the AD&D version, the way this thing was armored, like its natural armor, it had like a super high armor class on the front, but not on the back. That actually had a different armor class if you were hitting it from behind. And even something as simple as that, right, helps tell the narrative of the monster. And just a basic mechanic like that can create a different style of gameplay.
Yeah, that's a really good point. You need those interaction points, and in a game, we're not here to harp on D&D, but because in D&D the players are all fairly siloed, in that the initiative structure and the way their mechanics work, they're mostly just doing one thing themselves. So it is a little harder to coordinate to solve a problem together. It's why so many monsters just simply ask damage questions of the players. They're very aggressive, and can you kill them first? But other game structures that have either more fluid action economies or the players aren't quite so powerful individually, it starts to become how do we solve that problem, which I think is also stronger monster design. I like when a monster has an ability that one player cannot handle on their own. I think that's cool. The classic one I like to talk about is if a monster grabs a player in its mouth, and the player would have to be incredibly strong to get it on their own, but there's ways for the players to help them get free. It becomes a party problem now. The players asked a question, can you save this guy before he gets swallowed? And that's cool. That's a story beat, more than just, well, he probably has about 35 hit points remaining, so let's try to just stack the damage on it and kill it. Right.
Yeah, and I dropped the ball last night because I was running my usual Thursday night game, and they were doing one of the quests from the Infinite Staircase, and there's this web creature in there. It grabbed 2 of the players, which was a change. It's only supposed to be able to grab 1 at a time, but I made it grab 2 because I wanted to up the stakes. But it has the ability to transfer damage to anything caught in the web, right? Which was really cool. But if I really had my game design hat on in the middle of the session, when my players said, is there a way I can get close enough to it that I can hit it without it being able to use that ability to damage my friend, right? And of course, the way it's written, the answer to that is no. And I ran with that because they were close to killing it anyway. But as it like after the fact, I was like, man, I missed an opportunity. I should have just come up with some quick thing. Like if you can find a way to give yourself advantage while you're within 5 feet of it, right? Something like that. If I just I missed that opportunity to latch onto that question and make the monster, ask the player a better question, right?
Right. There has to be an answer out there, right, to the question for the players to latch onto. I feel you though. Sometimes, especially late in the session, I don't have it in me to to be game designer mid-session sometimes, right? Well, and a lot of D&D monsters, I'd say especially in the 5.5 monster manual, ask that they're binary in what they how they attack. The monster hits and applies an additional rider effect of some sort, like a condition, if they hit you. And it's you are stunned or not, right? Staggered or not, or what have you. And so a lot of those are they don't ask a question that has an interesting answer. The answer is, do I have lesser restoration? Not so much the right kind of question to be answered, because that's also a binary ability, right? These are just switching a toggle on and off. And it's a lot harder to design monsters that don't ask binary questions, right? Is it on or off? Doing something like at least a ternary, at least 3. Some way that they can be solved apart from I cleanse it. Right. That's kind of the World of Warcraft approach, right? Is I haven't played that in a long time, but there's some bosses in that game. The way the fights work is that they have a thing they do to the players, and the way you stop it is by clicking your cleanse button if you're a healer, right? That's a reflexes thing, not an interesting design interaction.
Yeah. Well, so having just run the monsters I did last night, coming to the realization exactly what you just said, right? That what I can do with 5th edition to make it a better game is every time the monster does something like that, like in this case, there was a memory ability. So the players lost their memory and now they have to subtract a die roll every time they make an ability check. But the answer to that is a healing spell or lesser restoration. From now on, my goal is going to be to come up with an answer in the campaign setting.
Yeah.
Who do you have to go see that's going to help you? So now my answer to all those questions are going to be, instead of lesser restoration as the answer, there's going to be at least 2 different NPCs that are going to have that answer.
Yeah.
So now the players have choices of who they need to go visit, which takes us back to downtime, right? Who do I need to go
Mm-hmm.
visit before we can go back into the dungeon because I've got to get rid of this ability?
Yeah, it's a story
You
now.
must purify yourself in the waters of Lake Minnetonka.
Exactly. Yeah, that's really neat. And it's cool when those kind of things can be built in when designing the monster, right? It'd be nice if that was already there to some degree, right?
Right.
One would hope. But when you have 500 monsters in a monster manual, each one can't be an essay, right? Just really involved. Each one can't be a 3-page, spread of information. I get it. Yeah, I think that's when monsters are the most memorable. Going back to the Roper, one of my favorites. The Roper asks a fun question when you fight it. Where is it? It starts grabbing you from 50, 60 feet away and pulls you out into the darkness. And it's saying, can you get free of these tentacles and find it before it starts chomping you? Because its attack is incredibly deadly if it can pull you to its maw. And that's a little puzzle now. Because if you find the Roper out in an empty field, if I lay down my grid and I put a Roper mini in the middle of it, the players just shoot it, right, with their bows or spells. But put it in a stalactite and stalagmite filled cavern in the darkness, and now we're talking. So a good monster is really weak, has this weakness to it, right? The Roper is actually not that threatening if you just set it on its own. But it asks in the right circumstance this really cool little puzzle of what you can do.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the threat of it biting you that's interesting.
Yeah.
right? It's when you see the maw open and you're getting pulled toward it. It doesn't matter if you never dealt a single point of damage to the player. Just the threat of that is super cool.
Yeah, and one thing that I've done with this Roper before that makes it a really interesting encounter is using the piercers as well.
Yeah,
Right?
So evil. I love it.
So you can drop the piercers on them. So that's basically becomes the Roper's ranged attacks because it has all these little like babies of itself, right? Like its children are these piercers that are dropping down on you. But the other thing you can do is if you have a convoluted maze like cavern, the piercers are kind of like the spotter for the Roper.
Yeah.
Right. So these things are psychically connected or whatever. So the Roper is able to see through the piercer's eyes. So the Roper is able to grab you from around corners.
Yeah, that's super cool.
And you might not know that it's the piercer right above your head that's allowing that Roper to see you around the corner. Right.
Yeah.
And then that's a puzzle for them to figure out is how is this thing finding us around the corners? Like we're hiding from this thing and it still sees us. And then,
one of my favorite Roper fights, because I keep reusing them when I run D&D, is it was like a 3 or 4 story building partially destroyed. And there was a Roper at the top that grabbed a player on the bottom floor and was pulling them up through the holes in the ceiling. But the players had to run up the stairs. And so the player is getting pulled floor by floor. And the players are trying to like, okay, I cast fly on this guy and he can fly up there, right? It becomes a whole scene from one of the, again, forgotten monsters out there. Yeah. Roper's the best.
Oh man.
Other things you can do is combining spell effects, right, with your monsters. So I once built a dungeon around the spell guards and wards, right? Because with guards and wards, there's multiple different things you can do to fortify a location, right? And one of the things it can do, I can't remember if it's command or some enchantment spell. You can, with guards and wards, you can put like an enchantment spell. In the dungeon. So I put the enchantment on a suit of animated armor. So nice. The player's digging around, he finds the animated armor, and then the enchantment says, "Put me on." So he starts putting on the armor, and then the armor, because it's animated, starts walking him towards the big bad, right?
That's great.
And so now it's a puzzle. How can we get this armor off of him before it drags us all?
Yeah, stop him. Yeah, that's great.
Finding ways to take a monster and present, I don't like using the word puzzle because I'm not a fan of puzzles in D&D, but that scenario where there's a problem to be solved, right?
Yeah, it asks an interesting question. Right. That encounter you designed asked a really fun question to the players that had nothing to do really with dealing damage. It was, oh no, he's in the armor, stop him, right? It's and now suddenly all those spells that you get teased for choosing as a wizard suddenly become really useful, right? All the utility stuff, you're giving that a time to shine. These characters that maybe have abilities that don't just deal hit point damage, because you've asked a question that can't be answered by killing something. Right. I think that's really cool. Yeah.
Well, and monster of the week, right? That's part of the design in that game is they tell you, this monster can't be killed until you solve this problem, right? The 5th edition now has or 5.5 has the new hag, the Archhag.
Oh yeah.
And you can't kill the Archhag unless you have its anathema. And that's good design, right? Because now there's a story there. What is the anathema? How do we find it? How do we get it? What's in the way of getting that, right? You can have a whole adventure around just getting the anathema, much less trying to fight this hag.
Ties it into a story. It's super cool. Still gives you some freedom there to play with, right? Where do they find the anathema and so forth? Yeah. And it's more in line with like established folklore about these kinds of characters. And, very few of the folklore stories involve somebody walking up to the creature and just hitting it with a sword, right? That's not usually the process. There's something much more involved that has to go into it.
Yeah, well, think of the old movie Dragon Slayer. I don't know if you guys have ever seen that,
Yeah.
right? But in that movie, I mean, spoilers for a movie that's almost as old as I am. The character sneaks into the dragon's lair and sneaks out with a bunch of the dragon's scales, and then goes and makes a shield out of the dragon's scales. So now its shield is strong enough to resist the dragon's breath because it's made from the dragon.
Yeah,
like
cool.
Those kind of ideas, making your monster almost unbeatable unless you find a creative solution, right? That generates a story, and that's a really good big bad.
Yeah, and it empowers the players when they get their special spear that will pierce the dragon's hide, right, or what have you. They get to feel powerful when fighting this thing that they couldn't defeat otherwise. Now they rock its world, right? That they get revenge and they feel like a badass now, and that's really cool from a mechanics standpoint. Yeah, absolutely. I know we've mostly just been talking about mechanics about monster design, because there is the narrative side too, right? I will just to kind of talk about it really fast. I think monsters are more interesting when you build them as if the characters in the world diegetically are describing them to you, and they don't know exactly how to kill the arch hag, but there's stories on how to kill the arch hag. That's way more interesting. And maybe they don't even call it an arch hag. Maybe they call it, like, you know, the green grandma or something. They just have a name for it locally, right? Yeah. That, I think, draws players in so much more than what is a taxonomical name. The Chain Devil drives me nuts. It's just like, it's such a cool enemy mechanically and design wise. But then it's called Chain Devil, and it's devil name of, like, what is it? Katon, or I forget what it's called. That's also not very evocative. Like, what would people call it, right? Give me something a little bit more folklore like, because that's how throughout history people have conceptualized monsters, just through folklore.
Yeah, I think the Hook Horror is a much better name for a Chain Devil.
Yeah.
Right?
That does sound better, doesn't it? That's more like a horror movie thing. Oh, and I saw Phil said Kyton is the name of the Chain Devil. But anyway, that doesn't exactly who's going to call it that? Like, the local peasants don't call it that, right? Yeah. So I think
the Janklin Jimmy, like, what are they?
Yeah, something like that. Reading actual real life folklore, if you're going to design your own monsters, read some real folklore and what people have called things, and it's way more interesting. You get cool names. I remember I just picked up a new Native American mythology book over last weekend and started reading it. And they had a really cool name, not for a monster, but just for a divine entity. And it was The Great Mystery Above. I thought, what a name. Man, that's cool. Right? Real folklore actually has such evocative names in it that don't come off as scientific. Right? I think that's what people should aim for.
And there's several traditions where, like, naming the thing is dangerous. Yeah. So, like, even if it does, like, you know the demon's name, like, unless you have the capability of, like, containing it, you are absolutely never going to say the thing, right? Fun fact for all the language nerds out there, the word bear is just the Indo-European descriptor, like the brown thing, because they were afraid to say the actual, we have lost the name that they called that creature because they were so afraid to say it because it could summon the thing that you do not want to deal with. We're not talking like claw bite here. No big deal.
Yeah, if you design a monster that just claw bites, I will find you.
No, I mean, that's fine. If you're afraid, like, Voldemort, right? Like, whatever. Pick your favorite fantasy, but, like, don't say that, oh, this is an aboleth, right? Ooh, like, somebody who's run a bunch of D&D is like, that's okay, I'm level 7. I can't touch an aboleth right now. Okay, that's one level of cognitive interest. But just, like, describing how your character has never seen a thing like this before, has no context for it. It has triangular eyes and trilateral symmetry, which doesn't quite make sense for you. It almost, like, hurts to process what this thing is, and it's impossibly large. and it seems to be swimming, but it's flying, and you don't know what this is. And maybe someone's like, "Oh, I think that's an aboleth," but it's a much more interesting experience for everybody at the table versus like, yeah, it's page 212, guys. Open up your notebook to
Right.
to this math problem.
Yeah. It's you'll fool veteran players that way too. If you just change up small details, because a lot of them remember the stats, they may not remember the fine details like of the aboleth, right?
Right.
That can get them, especially if the people in the adventure, they go to the fishing village that is losing people. They won't call it an aboleth because how would they know that? Right? You can call it something else and you get stories about it. And you can build dread much more effectively that way. That's how I always think, right? I think horror. You build that interest and dread much more.
Yeah, and you can foreshadow it because the local peasantry, they don't know what to call it, right? Or they have this like eerie, esoteric name for it, right? But then there's the effects of it. You go to town and everything's twice as expensive because because we can't go fishing anymore. This thing has poisoned the water. And we can't eat fish anymore, which is our main source of food. So now venison is 3 times as much, right?
Yeah.
And
logistics. Yeah.
Yeah. And people are paranoid, right? And then people are angry and blaming each other. Well, if you hadn't, done this,
yeah, because they
right,
don't know what's causing it.
The gods are punishing us, right? Because right.
Yeah, and what a fun downtime. It's not the adventure proper, but they could be in this fishing town just to shop, right? Yeah, that's a really good point. That way you can build up with all those logistics we were talking about, right? Where do they get their food? Where do they get their supplies? And the peasantry, they might be mistaken as to what's an effect of the monster and what's not.
Right.
We've had a really bad winter this past winter. That could be coincidence. So you can give them false data too, because they don't know. They're just trying to make sense of a really scary high fantasy world.
Yeah. And so think of all the superstitions that we have in our world, right? And how can you tie that to a monster?
Yep. Think of what we fear we can't control. I know, Ryan, we talked a lot about this on when we were talking before, but about tying things to like fears of the times that the people live, uncertainties, food, like, classics where you have things like starvation, disease, all that kind of stuff. That's just can tie you to your game really well, especially if you're going for a particular time period. Like, just to plug my game again, mine's late 19th century, so it's Industrial Revolution. So there's monsters that tap into the fears of that time, that are expressions of it. So that makes it stronger. What would people believe about tuberculosis is one thing. Like, what are their thoughts on where that comes from? If they don't fully understand, maybe it's a monster.
Yeah, and like we have the superstition that if you break a mirror, it's 7 years bad luck, right? So what, especially Fae, like what kind of Fae creature could you connect to mirrors that explains why there's 7 years of bad luck if you break a mirror, right?
Yeah.
So just take a simple superstition that we already have in our world and connect it to a monster. Like that's going to create like a narrative around your creature, so that by the time your players face it, right, there's this build up to that monster.
Yeah, that's great.
And better yet,
you can see peasants, like you can see people in the town observing some superstition. You notice that whenever they cross the threshold of a door, they do something, right? And you start noticing all the peasants doing it, all the townsfolk, and you're like, that's weird. You start building it up right then.
Yeah. And then if you can also connect that to a mechanic, right, so that the monster asks the question, and maybe you need a mirror to defeat this monster. Right?
Exactly. Yeah. Now we're talking.
And so now you're adding mechanics to your narrative, and your mechanics are inspired by that narrative, right? And you're creating an interesting loop that tells a story.
Yeah, super cool. Oh, I love it. Okay, I have my wheels are turning. I got to go write my own monster manual now. Happy Valentine's Day, everybody. Get creepy with it. Build some awesome monsters. Have some downtimes with the ones you love, platonically or romantically. And yeah, Peter, this was a blast. Thank you for sitting in. Definitely appreciate you, man.
Yeah, I really
Yeah.
appreciate coming on and hanging out with you two. It was a lot of fun. Definitely a good way to spend my lunch break on a work day.
Brad, always a pleasure, man. Appreciate you.
Yeah.
And thank you everybody in chat for hanging out. Some awesome stuff today. Appreciate you all. Happy Friday and enjoy the weekend, everybody. Bye.